You're listening to the Future is Freelance podcast, the show for solopreneurs, digital nomads and slowmads, consultants, remote workers, e-residents, and everyone living a life without traditional boundaries. We're here for people who defy categorization, people who make a life and a living their own way. Every Freelance Friday, we bring you expert tips, inspired insights, and stories from the frontiers of freelancing to help you achieve success with your borderless business and life, whatever success means to you, as you move through the world on your own terms. And today, we're bringing you a really interesting interview with the CEO of Remote Base, Chris Cerra. Chris is from the UK, like me, but he's been all over the world with his business. And even before that, because we dig back a little bit into his life story, the service he offers now is to help people find accommodation for remote working and longer digital nomad stays. So you're not limited to the quite pricey per night kind of deals that you get on accommodation booking platforms. So he really is an expert when it comes to finding somewhere to stay. Do check out Chris's links in the show notes. But in the meantime, enjoy his thoughts and reflections as we dig into some of the realities of digital nomad and remote work life and go beyond the things that you might see on the Instagram feeds. So Chris, it's great to have you with us at The Future is Freelance. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a really, really nice invitation off the back of some content, and it got me very, very curious about this whole conversation, and I'm very, very much looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, we're looking forward to getting to know you a little bit better. It says on your LinkedIn bio that remote work changed your life in 2017. So maybe we should start there. Tell us a bit about what happened then, what was happening before, and what's happening now.
Oh yeah, straight in. I like that. Um, I was working at a company based in London. I started a role there in 2016, and prior to that, I'd worked in London before. I'd worked in other cities in the UK before, and I'd moved around quite a lot actually. I'd not really graduated for very long, maybe 4 or 5 years out of university, and lived in as many cities with work. But that was all in the UK, and
Mm.
that was in 2016 was when I took that role, and it was an amazing company. Amazing. Like they were so progressive, and their approach to everything from the culture internally to the organizational structure to the management hierarchy, it was all very, very progressive. We had policies like self-set pay, and I
Wow.
think that the official policy on work was like you can work wherever you want, whenever you want, however you like, without telling anyone, within like as long as
Amazing.
it doesn't interrupt business or something. It was like as long as business isn't impacted, like we don't care what you do, was kind of the yeah, that was the feel. That was what was
Wow.
happening.
And then this was in the
And
UK. That's
this
that's
was in,
just so
in the UK,
unusual.
right? It was like pre-pandemic, and
Mm.
before all of like the remote work buzzwords and stuff. But it was amazing, and I was living in Bristol before I took that role, and I moved back to London for this role. And in my first kind of week, I was doing all of like the introduction calls and everything else that happens when you have a job. And I found myself on a call with somebody who was in Croatia, a Canadian guy who was in Croatia, and he was only there for a month, and he was part of one of these cohort programs where you take like a bunch of people traveling for a year, and you spend a month in each place.
Mm.
All of these kind of um, travel cohort companies, they were in their infancy as well at this time, and he
Of
was on
course,
one of the
yes.
first programs that was running. And I was just like astounded, because travel was something that was a was a like a big aspiration for
Mm.
me, and it was something that I tried to do as much of before I went into the world of work. Um, and I'd kind of given up. I was like, okay, cool. Like maybe I go on city breaks every couple of months, and
Yeah.
then I'll have a couple of big holidays a year, and that will be my life. And then yeah,
It's a life for most people.
Yeah, exactly, right. And so I'd moved back to London, extortionate rent, um, good pay, but still, exorbitant cost of living. It's probably even worse now. But yeah, even back then it was high. And then I learned, we also had like one guy was based in Shanghai. We had this whole team of people that was like 80% based in London and 20% based everywhere else. And so I bedded in for a year and worked with the team, built real internal relationships, all this other stuff. And then around about 2017 was when I started to work remotely, um, domestically at first,
Hmm.
at home or from my parents' house or from friends' places around the UK. And then 2018 was where I took the show on the road.
Hey.
And then by 2019, I had began on the road with remote base, which it was kind of a side project at the time, and it turned into my now full-time full-time job. It's my own business. So
Fantastic.
that's
So
kind of
you
like
got your
a
first remote experience as an employee then with somebody else who gave you that amazing unlock that you could go and work anywhere, proved the case, proved that you could work that way as well, because not everybody can or does successfully and happily.
yeah
And yeah, then you moved into your own side hustle, so which is now your full-time hustle. So tell me about remote base.
yeah. Remote base was it was a labor of love to begin with. I and my girlfriend were traveling around, spending 1 month at a time in different places, or maybe 2 months at a time, and doing that we realized like if you book somewhere for 1 month, you don't pay the nightly price that is
Mm.
cited on all of the short-term rental sites. You can often get a pretty ludicrous discount. So what began as like a little hobby of like saving all of these places that were available with huge discounts turned into a list of places that was longer than we could commit to. Like there were more places than we could stay in. It was impossible. So I started to like share these or share the idea of these places with other remote workers. So again, this is like 2018, 2019. Um, so remote work was definitely a thing, but it hadn't had that huge upswing that the pandemic induced. So there
Mm.
was some like online communities for remote workers, Slack groups, stuff like that. And so I was sharing this concept with people in those groups, and the feedback was that that would be something that people wanted to see. So I started a mailing list. I bought a domain name. That's often how these
Mm.
things begin, right? Um,
Oh yeah.
and started a mailing list, and that was kind of it. And it ran alongside my job as a completely free project, kind of just for the community for years. And it was only in 2022 that I monetized it and
Right.
started winding down my day job.
Excellent. So I was going to ask how that was affected by the lockdowns and the pandemic. Obviously, everybody experienced remote work for many people for the first time and maybe
For
started to
better
see
or
the
worse.
potential for better or worse. Indeed, some people had a terrible experience, as we know, and couldn't wait to get back to the office. Some of them couldn't wait to get back to 2019, and that was never going to happen. And obviously, some organizations failed completely at the big experiment, but there must have been a lot of other people who were desperate to travel but couldn't. Were they joining your list? Were they hearing about the possibility and just waiting to get unlocked and get on the road?
I think so. There was a big part of me that didn't really want to kind of actively promote travel through that
Mm.
period. So I wasn't really sending a lot of stuff. Um,
Yeah.
but the sign up stayed active and stayed alive. And there was definitely all things considered, it was surprising to see people signing up through that time. Um, and then yeah, as the world emerged, I switched things back on again,
Mm.
and yeah, I took things way more seriously with the newsletter, and that allowed me to kind of walk away from the day job. I'm sure like freelancers listening to this might have had a similar experience, right? Where maybe they had one small client on the side of their day
Mhm.
job, and then things snowballed and took over. Um, I didn't really have the luxury of that snowball impact. I was like, I need to switch on the monetization and I need to turn off my day job. I
Yeah,
tried to do the snowball thing. I tried to go like part time, and that was good for a while. But then realized I was just doing two things badly, um, which is never good. So I decided I was going to do one thing and try and do it well, and that was this. It wasn't the day
and that
job.
was this.
So
Brilliant.
that was the kind of
That's
decision
really
I made.
interesting what you identified there, because a lot of people still think work should be measured in hours. And yeah, then in theory, you can say, I'm going to do X hours in this role, and then with the rest of my hours, I'm going to do something else. But we've only got one brain, and that brain is
Yeah,
working on the problem solving, and it's occupying bandwidth the whole time. And yeah, this is exactly why it's crazy to measure work by the hour, by the time served, because it's about what you produce and create. And you were clearly finding that remote base was taking up more and more headspace, as you were seeing more and more potential in it, more and more demand for your input and attention there. So you did the honourable thing by your former employer and went all in, which is really
yeah.
exciting. So yeah, this is yeah, it's funny how some people think they can be CEO of several organizations and still say everybody has to go back to the office. But we won't go there. Uh,
Fuel on the
so
fire.
what was it like that moment then? Because this is something I think a lot of freelancers will relate to. In fact, what was that pivot point for you where you suddenly thought, I can make this into a viable business as opposed to a passion project?
I was kind of, well, part of me never really knew. I think
Hmm.
there's always a part of you that never really knows. Um, and you know, you can do all manner of tests and research. Like remote base is essentially it's an entirely online business, right?
Hmm.
And so a lot of the time you will hear people speak in like the indie hacker community or on spaces like this where they'll say, you know, put up a put a put a page up where people can pay for the product, but have the
Hmm.
payment fail, have like the card payment fail,
Right,
so that
just
you
as
can
a
see how,
test.
yeah, just so you can see how many people are really willing to go all the way through, like not just add to cart, like they've got to put their card details in, you know, all of this stuff. Um, and I never really did that. I was just like, I'm never
Mm.
going to know. You are never going to know. So you just have to do it. And part for me, it was more like, if I don't do it, I'll never know.
Yeah,
I'll never know.
and you had
I'll
it
never be able
anyway.
to say that I tried.
Yeah, you'd built the product anyway, so there wasn't any point trying to play at it at that point, was there? And
Yeah.
simulate sign-ups. You might as well just jump over the cliff. But it's a scary one, right? Because you were leaving behind what sounds like a really good job that gave you a lot of the lifestyle elements that you wanted. So it was,
Yeah.
yeah,
I think it's almost like it's not like a bad breakup is almost better in some ways, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah.
amicable breakups kind of suck. Um, Whereas at least, you know, if I had a terrible job or a boss that I hated, like it would have been really easy to walk away. But this was actually,
Yes.
yeah, it wasn't an easy choice. But yeah, I think the things that made me really, you know, pull the pin out were, if I don't do it, I will never know if it's possible or
Hmm.
if I have it in me. Um, and the other thing was just the timing, like where the world was felt like the right time. Like
Right.
people were going to be coming out of the pandemic, travel saw a huge uptick, remote work saw a huge uptick. The kind of product of those things is that digital nomadism also has this huge upswing. Um, and so it kind of felt like it felt like it would have been foolish not to leave my job, as bizarre as
Yes.
that sounds.
It
Um,
was the moment.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah,
that's great. So were at that point, were we starting to see the emergence, or were people at least talking about digital nomad visas as well? Was that a factor in your timing?
I think that came a little bit after,
Right.
as well. I think at this point there would have been a handful. There would have been like maybe less than five. I think the Bahamas had one, which was like extremely
Yeah.
popular around that time. But we'd not seen that snowball,
Couldn't call it a
effect
trend at
where,
that point. Yeah.
yeah, it was nascent. Yeah.
I suppose to say now about half the world has a digital nomad visa access to it one way or another, or half the number of countries in the world. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's the landscape has changed just a little bit there. And
definitely.
you obviously you must have seen that coming somehow, because it's such an amazing trend to be able to respond to, and you were giving people the tools to actually take advantage of that and spend a bit of time traveling and doing different things. So amazing. How easy was it then to switch the audience you already have over to a premium paid version? Was there
Not
pushback? Did you
easy.
lose many people? What were your
I think
lessons there?
anybody who's a freelancer or anyone who's like running something online for themselves will always remember that moment where they have like the first paying customer, like the first invoice that gets paid or something. And I'll
Yes.
never forget, I was in Portugal at the time, and I'd put a date in the diary, right? Of like, it's going to happen on this day,
Mm.
no matter what. And I spent all day, whether it was through, I think part of it's through like fear of like, what if I put this out in the world and then nobody buys it?
Mm.
And I've just quit my job, um, or
Understandable
some
fear,
other
really.
reason.
Yeah.
Completely understandable fear, but I think one that I think is natural.
Yes.
But I'd spent all day like finalizing the launch copy and everything. It all had to be perfect, and it had gotten to like 10 p.m. So I was just like, okay, there is no more. There is nothing more
Mm-hmm.
that I can do here. I need to hit send, go for a walk, maybe sleep, and then forget about it and start looking for jobs tomorrow.
Yeah.
no,
At least give it overnight to see if any. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I went out for a walk, and I'd kind of, I tried to check myself out of it, and I think I was doing that thing that you do where you just refresh your email almost on
Oh, yeah.
autopilot, and people had made payments, and I was like, wow, this is insane. Um, so
Amazing.
that was kind of how it started, and now I don't really have the most optimal conversion rate from free to premium. I think there's probably a lot more that I can do. I'll probably have to like annoy a lot of people first before I figure out where that balance is. But I also monetize on the free newsletter. So the free
Mm-hmm.
newsletter operates with sponsorships.
Right.
So I'm not like, whilst having the premium product is great, I'm also, it's not the only way for me to monetize the audience.
Yeah.
So I don't feel like I have a gun to my head in that scenario.
No,
Um,
that's great. Yeah. So
yeah,
clearly you
I
built
try
a
to be
whole
respectful
business
with it,
around it.
but yeah,
Yeah. It's a difficult one. People are used to getting so much content and information for free these days, like this podcast you're listening to now, and all of that you receive on your device every week for free. It is difficult to start paying for content, and it's very difficult to flip something from free to premium. So it clearly meant that lots of people saw tremendous value there and were keen to uh, move in that direction in their life. I guess it spoke to a hunger that was emerging at that time. People wanted this lifestyle for themselves. So, because that's what you're enabling, really, isn't it? It's a lifestyle change.
yeah. I think part of the mission for me is like, you know, remote work changed my life, and
Mm,
like I often try to think like, what would my life look like if that job that I took in London was not so remote friendly.
yeah,
What trajectory would that have put me on in comparison to now? Probably would never have met you. Um,
you'd still be commuting and having a holiday
yeah,
once a year or something.
right. Yeah. Um, And so, yeah, part of the mission is really like help other people either begin or continue um, on their own remote work and travel journey, whatever that looks like. You know, some people are like
Hmm.
full-time nomadic families. Other people just want to do like the extended workation style getaway once a year. It's a really broad spectrum. So as a kind of mission statement, I try to keep it broad, but you're right. Ultimately, it's just about helping other people enable a lifestyle for themselves.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And yes, completely aligned mission with the Future is Freelance and Remote Work Europe to help people see the benefits for themselves and unlock that lifestyle if that's what they choose. But I was drawn to some of your recent content that you've been creating about, whilst this is aspirational for lots of people, you've been trying to ground things in reality a little bit more than, let's say, some digital nomad content can be. And you've been sharing some diaries and some sort of quite journalistic entries of what went well today, what I did, what didn't go so well, what I did, and trying to give people a bit of a flavor of a day in a life. So we'll link to all that in the show notes because I think it's entertaining and it's interesting. But what was the reason behind that? Why did you feel you wanted to share your life on the road in that very unfiltered way?
Um, I think I just got bored of seeing like this like glossy aesthetic
Mm,
that's out there. It, it doesn't feel. I almost feel like it actually does damage to the lifestyle, or like, you know, how can we sit here on a call like this or in a conversation with somebody and say, you know, this lifestyle is fulfilling and other people should experiment with it. And like I basically say to people, just try it. I know you like, even people, when people say to me like, oh, I don't know how you did it, or I don't, you know, how is it even possible, or there's like these weird objections or hurdles that people have, I'm just like, look, book a flight. I will personally help you find accommodation at a very good price to remove that barrier. But just try it. Just try it for
yeah.
1 month and tell me that you don't like it. Because I think if people can at least say they've tried it, then like I'll listen to the objections. But I don't want to hear the objections up front.
Yeah.
And so it's
Fair.
very difficult to say that. Whilst on the other side, all you ever see is all of the glossy stuff. You never see any of the challenging things. Because I think, yeah, I think it's easier for people to see that it's easier for people to accept that it's real if they see that it's
Mm,
challenging or that there are
yes.
challenges. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
we've got to get
sometimes I
away
think it
from
feels
the
unattainable because it doesn't feel real.
yeah, the palm trees and the laptops on the beach Instagram shots talk about the realities. It frustrates me a lot that people don't talk enough about the work, and
Hmm.
that's what seems to be the biggest barrier to people because it's we have services like remote base to access accommodation now. We have visas, we have apps, we have devices that are small and portable, we have really good cellular coverage over so much of the world now. The main obstacle to many people from unpacking this lifestyle is still work and not being able to take their work with them that they've already got, or not having work that is suitable. And that seems to me, certainly in remote work Europe, the issue that most people have is that reality. And I don't know, my feeling is we don't see enough content about the work, about transitioning into work that you can do from. Where did you say you were on this call today, Chris?
I am in Thailand, northern Thailand.
Right. So you need work that's not just location independent, but to an extent sort of time zone independent or asynchronous that you can carry out from anywhere. This seems to be, I think a lot of people they see the hammocks on the beach and the influencer
Coconuts.
Instagrams, coconuts everywhere, and that's all great. But then I get DMs from people saying, "How do I get into the remote work industry? Where is this list of remote work jobs?" As though it's a completely separate thing from the world of
Mm.
work that they were used to, and that it means changing careers or it necessarily means giving up everything they're familiar with and entering into this strange new world of remote work jobs, as though they're something utterly separate. Whereas your case was a very good example. You got a job that you didn't even know offered that degree of flexibility until you realized that other colleagues were enjoying that, and it was just
Yeah.
work, right?
It's interesting because you hit on something which is, I guess, I can't blame people for like building content strategies and building businesses out of this like emergence of remote work. I think like, hey, it's great, keep doing it. But one thing that I remember, maybe people don't remember this because they didn't see it, but pre-pandemic, there were businesses and people, like the big voices in this space weren't they weren't pushing the secret list of remote job boards that no one knows about. They were actually pushing something different, which was, let me help you convince your existing employer to help you go remote.
Yeah.
Because at that point, there was this complete understanding that like it is just work. It's just work. It's just that you're not doing it. It's not remote work. It's just work.
Yes.
And so, yeah, I think there's a bit of a hype train that goes with everything that we've seen, which builds us into like you say, where's this secret list? The secret list that we have access to that other people don't.
Yeah. How do I change to doing that like you do?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wish I had got that list. I wish I could just hand people a silver platter with a remote job on it. That's going to change their life. And I know that we have got pushback from employers as well, who have sometimes been subject to stealth digital nomading and people sneaking off. It started during lockdown. I think there are a lot of people who found themselves maybe not quite at home when they decided to hunker down, and maybe didn't mention that to their boss.
Yeah.
And do you know what? They got away with it. Actually, for the most part, the work carried on, and until they had a health insurance claim or a random IP check or something that brought it all crashing down. So I think maybe, do you think organizations have been burned as well? Is that the pushback we're seeing, or is it all just coming from managers who don't have a clue and want people back where they can see them?
It's really interesting. I think this happens at so many different levels. I think, I think probably the most applicable way to look at this for the sake of this conversation is like at an organizational culture level. And I think if we look at this idea that the future is freelance, maybe one way to assess the change in dynamic of organizational culture is maybe it's against your employment contract for you to work somewhere else. So maybe you don't have an employment contract. Maybe you have a freelance contract, which kind of removes that shackle. I think this all links in very nicely with the rise of like fractional work that we see and all of these other things. I think the other way to look at it is a bit more like top down. Like I've seen so much material and like research that comes from I don't know who it comes from. I don't know where it comes from, which is really bad, but that's how research on the internet works these days. You don't always know exactly where the original source is.
True.
But what feels like really credible sources have also cited that like a lot of the return to work mandates are kind of driven by huge, big VC companies, huge private equity companies, a lot of people who are involved in commercial real estate.
Oh yeah.
So I think that's one way to look at it, but I don't necessarily think that's the most applicable lens for the kind of futurist freelance conversation. I think actually more of the organizational culture view and more of how the kind of not just the future being freelance, but the future workplace will just change a lot.
It's just got to become more flexible, both contractually and locationally, I think. And we couldn't really call the show The Future is Blended Work or The Future is Fractional. We'd have just confused a lot of people. But certainly that what used to be a dichotomy between the 9 to 5 and freelancing is now a very complex spectrum of different ways of making a deal with somebody who wants to pay you for what you can do for them. And certainly, yeah, it's definitely, we're shifting along that spectrum. And I agree, for a lot of people, the way to go remote is to sever that employment contract, which is not something I'd ever encourage anybody to do on a whim. You can end up with giving up a lot in terms of the benefits that you get from it. We certainly see it's often been a route that people move from the UK to Spain, is to go freelance and set up a simple freelance structure here and contract to their previous employer, and that works. But they don't often realize what they've got to negotiate financially to really replicate the terms and conditions they had previously, and what that means in terms of their annual leave, allowing for being off sick from time to time, contributions to their retirement savings, which to try and get an equitable package is really difficult. But I suppose that's one of the steps that we want people to take as they move into this new world of work, is to own that, think about what you need, and then negotiate it.
What do you think is harder? Do you think that the kind of the what I'll call like the logistics aspect of it, which is stuff like that, or do you think more of like the mindset side of like it's possible? Like which do you think is a greater challenge for people?
What an interesting question. I think they're very closely linked. I think the mindset piece has to start first, because I think the reason I think that is because of the amount of people I meet through Remote Work Europe who cannot contemplate anything other than being employed and having those hard edges on what they do, what they can earn, what the deal is, what's expected of them. And once you take away those guardrails, there's so much more freedom and flexibility. But for a lot of people, that's terrifying. And maybe it's just terrifying because it's unknown and they don't realize. Whereas once people break out of that, not only is anything possible, but it's really impossible to go back in. I interviewed somebody in season 1 who was a CEO of an organization, a startup, but he said, yeah, I'm working for them, but I'm contracted with them under my limited company because I would never have an employment contract again. Don't want one. And because it was interesting talking to an entrepreneur who'd gone to work for somebody else, but he was doing it as a freelancer. I thought, yeah, I get it. And he'd completely broken out of that bubble of ever being employed. And just as many of us could never contemplate that now, going back to having 100% of your income and your activities in somebody else's control, it seems unthinkable now. But so many people are still in that mindset. So if we could do nothing else with this podcast, let's try and imagine stepping through that looking glass and seeing it from the other way around, that you own that process. You decide what you do and for whom.
Nudge the mindset. It's interesting because so much of pay is kind of like psychologically, it's like treacle pay. The topic of pay is like something you have to like struggle through mentally. You have to like wade through it, and it's sticky and gooey and ugh. And
especially for us Brits, right?
Yeah, right. So culturally not okay.
Yes. Can we talk about money?
Oh, cringe. But it's like so much of it can be, so much of our self-worth can be derived through what other people say they're willing to pay us. And actually, I think there's a big mindset change, which is like realizing, when you make the realization that there's X billion people on the planet and the internet is here and will help you take money from those people in the nicest sounding way. It's kind of bizarre that you would like limit your earnings to whatever salary it is that someone wants to pay you, whether it's like 50k, 100k, 200k. Like, why would you limit yourself to a set ceiling, like a ceiling set by somebody else, right?
Yes. Especially if they want you to do it so within an hour's travel of your apartment.
Right.
All these artificial constraints that seem so crazy when you step outside them and look at them. Even the idea of a job description, it's like a list of things drawn up by somebody else of how you're going to spend your working life, and they've bundled together some things that you probably love and are really good at, and some other things that they need done that tend to go with those things. And it just seems an extraordinary way to make a living once you're outside of that paradigm.
That's interesting because I just onboarded somebody today. Like I got a contract with somebody, contract important, remember, with somebody to help support me with remote base.
Mm-hmm.
And that is like, I am so conscious of exactly what you've just talked about. Like this idea of a job description. I'm like, I have to have something for like this ad of like, here's what I need doing, right? So it has to exist in to some degree. But like very, very quickly, once the decision was made, it's like, okay, now we speak together about what this looks like.
Yeah. What
And
about this excites you? What doesn't?
yeah,
What would you add? What would you? Yeah, brilliant. So
yeah,
you'll end up with somebody who actually cares and wants to
right.
operate
Like
in their zone of
I only want
excellence.
to do this once. I want to do it once and get the
Right.
right person and have them be with me for a long time and help me execute on loads of stuff that I see coming down the line. Not somebody to just like do the stuff maybe with some spite.
Yeah.
You know?
Put in the hours and take the money. That won't help you. So have
Yeah.
you found this person? Have you got? Did you
I
say you
found
were
this
onboarding?
person
Awesome.
onboarded today. Uh, yeah, ask me in a couple of months like how it's going.
I shall, because I'm very interested in on that sort of cusp from freelancing into more of a permanent team is something, a theme I've been returning to a lot this season, because it's a live issue for me. After years of being ruthlessly solo and independent, realizing that you do have to collaborate with other people, but how you make that arrangement is something that I want to walk my talk about and make sure that it's a great experience for everybody. So it seems like the future is freelance, but also flexible, blended, complicated, interesting. What do you see? Look, we're getting to the time of year where I'm going to start asking people, what do you see coming
Oh, okay.
down the pipe for 2024? What should we be looking at in this space? What should we be excited about?
I'm not really sure if it's something to be excited about, but I think honestly, I think that people should be prepared for like a longer, like the pendulum is going to keep swinging for a long time. It's kind of like it will keep swinging back and forth between office and remote and hybrid, and it'll just keep swinging. It's going to be, I think it will be a really, really long time before we see like appreciable change.
Mm,
Like, I think it'll be a really, really long time before we can look back and go, oh, yeah, that's different. And it was probably going to
yes.
move so slow that we don't really realize it in the moment. Kind of like watching a stock tick up and down. You know, you don't really realize until you zoom out what the change has been.
Yes. You can't see a
Um,
trend yet. It's too early.
yeah,
Too early to call it.
I don't think it's going to be, think about like the internet, or it's not going to be something as huge as that. But yeah, I think when we zoom out, it might be a 5 year thing or a 10 year thing when
Mm.
we realize actually,
We've
only
arrived. Here's
yeah,
the
like
new
only
normal.
20% of the people who used to work in an office still work in an office or
Yeah.
something like that, full time at least. And it's funny because you're obviously at what looks like a home office. I'm working in a
Yeah.
co-working space, which is basically a fancy word for an office. Um, and the difference is that this office is in Thailand.
Yeah. And that's where you've
Um,
chosen to be right now for as long as you want to be.
yeah,
And then you head off
don't
somewhere
know.
else.
I would like to think that maybe something that is a bit more visible will be the bleed from domestic to international. So I think as people kind of find their feet with domestic remote work, and believe in themselves that it's possible, and have built trust with their team or with their with the teams that they have contracted to,
Mm-hmm.
that they can then start to more comfortably move further afield. So maybe we'll just see more kind of global mobility in the next year.
Yes, just to experiment with it, to sort of try out some new things maybe in the new year. This was the year when I met you in Gran Canaria. That was the first year that my other half had started doing a bit of remote working, coming on trips with me, because he's in that working from home as an employee stage. And it's like, come on, you got a laptop. You're
Let's
coming
go.
with me on this one. Let's go. And, experiment with co-working, with co-living, with blending work and travel and life and experiences in new ways. And yeah, that's been an interesting experiment that's going to carry on in our household into 2024. So I think it sounds like between us there's a lot of changes going on, new team members, new opportunities, new adventures. I'm excited about that. Are you excited about the future?
I could not be more excited about the future.
Brilliant. Well, it's been a real pleasure talking to you about that today, looking at the past, the future, the now, the realities of remote work and freelancing. Chris from Remote Base, thanks ever so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Future is Freelance podcast. We appreciate your time and attention in a busy world and your busy freelance life. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a fellow freelancer and help us grow this movement of independent entrepreneurs. If you rate and review The Future is Freelance in whichever app you're listening to right now, it really helps spread the word, and that means we can reach more people who need to hear this message. Together we can change the world and make sure the future is freelance. Don't forget you can check out all our back episodes from other seasons and learn more over at futureisfreelance.xyz. We're so grateful, not only for our listeners, but for the contributions of our wonderful guests and for the production and marketing assistance of Coffee Like Media. This is Maya Middlemiss wishing you freelance freedom and happiness until our next show.